Ladies and gentlemen, we are live, and this is a very, very special edition of the Cheats Movement podcast because I am joined by two very special guests, and we're going to be talking about an amazing project that they have conducted, and it's released now. I'm very, very excited to welcome Mallory Noe-Payne, and I have to say it because everybody's going to say it. Pulitzer Prize winning columnist Michael Paul Williams from the Richmond Times-Dispatch. And they have just recently released, I believe all 6 parts are out now, but it is a amazing podcast called Memory Wars. And Memory Wars is a 6-part series about how Germany confronts its historic past. We are live, people, so you're going to hear some things in the background in this wonderful office that I'm in. Um, but it is a 6-part podcast series that explores how Germany confronted its horrific past when we talk about dealing with the history of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. And what Mallory and Michael have done is they've taken a year of Mallory's work and also had conversations about what that means here in America, in particular, what that means in the American South, and what that means in a place like Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the Confederacy. And it's this very amazing juxtaposition about what's happened over in Germany and what's currently happening in many ways still right here in the American South in the United States. So Mallory and Michael, welcome to the Cheats Movement.
So happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
It is an amazing project, and there are so many questions about where to start. And one of the interesting things I will bring up as I've started to listen to the first half of the series is you have Mallory, you have these amazing conversations, and it seems like oftentimes you're like, "Ooh, where do I start?" Because there's so much. I kind of feel that way now, but I'm going to try to start from the beginning because you have taken on a project in which you went to Germany for a year,
Mhm.
but anybody that knows anything about journalism and projects like this, and in particular in the space that you're working in now, this has to conceptually come well before that. How did you get to this place where you were even going to get on a plane on January 6th, by the way,
Yeah.
and go over? How do we get there conceptually to start Memory Wars?
So, yeah, I mean, you're right. The day I left for Germany was the day of the Capitol insurrection, January 6th, 2021. But the idea for this podcast and this project came well before then. I had spent years in Richmond covering policy and politics here in it's my hometown. Um, and during this very tumultuous set of years, anyone who knows anything about Virginia politics knows that we've undergone a lot of change in the past few years. And so when I first started covering policy and politics here, Republicans were in control of the General Assembly. And the first, I recently shared with Michael, the very first story I ever filed for national NPR was coverage of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. Um, and so that sort of was the beginning of my work in Virginia. And then over the next few years, I watched as that conversation about Confederate monuments evolved quickly, and public opinion shifted. And as politics changed year after year in the General Assembly, and then 2 summers ago, as protesters and marchers took to the streets in Richmond and literally pulled down Jefferson Davis themselves. And so this was the transition I was reporting on. And throughout it all, I heard multiple times from people in public debates and in public comments, you know, Germany doesn't have any statues of Hitler. And I didn't know anything about Germany. I was like, is that even true? But an opportunity presented itself to go and take a year off and spend a significant amount of time on a special project, and and specifically to do so in Germany. And it was the very first idea that came to my mind. I was like, what is there for us to learn from this country? And it was just immediately obvious to me. And so that was the starting point, was pulling together this idea of a comparison about, at least at the very beginning, the idea of monuments. But then, of course, it's ultimately so much more than that.
Michael, let me ask you, because conceptually, the way the podcast is structured is very interesting. Mallory is in Germany doing her journalism and reporting and having these conversations for a year, and then kind of as a interesting kind of part B of the podcast structure, not part B of the podcast, but podcast structure, she comes home and she's having conversations with you about the American South and Richmond, Virginia. When you heard about what Mallory was doing and the opportunity to discuss this kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of wrestling with, America's greatest sin, but also comparing it to what's happening in a place like Germany, what attracted you to this particular project in this particular format?
Well, when I learned, and I'm pretty sure it was on social media, that Mallory had gotten the Fulbright and what she was going to be doing with it, what she was going to be pursuing, I was absolutely thrilled, almost as much as if I were the one going to Germany. And in a way that I'm not sure I can fully explain right now, but I was excited. And I immediately reached out to her and say, "Hey, I got to write about this. Let's do this." And yeah, I mean, I too had heard they don't have statues to Hitler in Germany, and I took it on faith value because it's so utterly illogical for them to do that, just as it was utterly illogical for us to do it here. That it just made perfect sense that there wouldn't be statues of Hitler. Um, Nations that are thinking coherently don't do that sort of thing. So I reached out to Mallory, and this was like in COVID had started, right? Because we're doing a Zoom, and I hadn't done a Zoom in my life before COVID. So I said, let's do an interview. Let's Zoom. And when we Zoomed, and I don't think, had we like talked at all before the Zoom?
Very little. Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't, and I mean, you know how interviews can go, but I felt like an immediate connection. And I mean, it's almost like I can't say I foresaw that I would be part of this, but I just felt like I was part of it because I was like sharing the thrill of it so vicariously. And I was so engaged in the idea. I thought the idea was brilliant, in the way that things that we all kind of think of, but no one really executes and tests. Oh, are there statues of Hitler in Germany? I'm like, oh yeah, this is going to be good.
Mm.
I knew it was going to be good. So I wanted to, like, when she was in Germany, I kind of like wanted to keep abreast of what was happening because I wanted to feel a part of it because I knew I'd be writing about it when she came back, but just not in the way that I ended up doing.
So that's a good point. And Mallory, every project kind of starts with a concept and then reality hits. You hit the ground and the project has to morph. And it may morph along the guidelines of what you expected, but there's always concept and there's the reality. Like the old adage is, what it was, the Mike Tyson custom auto thing, everybody has a plan until they get hit in the face. And then they have to change the plan. When you set out to Germany for the year to explore this, what was your intentions and what were you hoping to learn? And piggyback into when were the first times reality really hit you in the face?
So I've said it multiple times since I've been home, and Mike has heard me say it multiple times. I was so naive. I like I mentioned, I don't have much experience in German history. I took some German lessons, so my language skills were minimal. But I guess I thought that I would just come back with a template, with a playbook, with a here's what we've got to do, here's what they did. And it quickly became clear that that how things unfolded in Germany were not easy, that it took generations, that it was incredibly messy. And I would say that one of the first moments that hit me was when I was talking to Germans about this idea, and I got pretty consistent negative feedback, being like, well, do you really want to look at Germany as an example? Like, we haven't done that good of a job.
Clearly, they're clueless about how poor a job we've done.
I'm gonna get to that, Mike. I'm gonna get to that, but there's a part of this I have to ask you. But go ahead.
I mean, so as soon as Germans started telling me two things, really, like, oh, you can't compare anything to the Holocaust, like that is a very taboo thing in German culture and society. Part of their internal narrative is that the Holocaust is the absolute worst thing that's ever happened and that Germans are responsible for it. And so anything that seems to downplay that fact in any way, for instance, like saying, America also did some really bad, terrible things, there's a pushback to that. And so that was one of my very first things I realized was, oh, this is going to be a little bit harder than I thought. And to have Germans say to me, like, I'm not so sure about the premise of this because, we have a lot of work still to do and we haven't done that great a job. So are you sure you want to look at us as an example? And so that was when I realized, like, oh, one, this is going to be hard, but two, part of what they've done well is be really self-critical.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's a theme that goes through pretty much all the episodes about kind of like self-assessment, self-analyzing, self-critical, self-inquisitive, and it comes up in a lot of the conversations with Mike. Um, but it is fascinating, even early on. It's fascinating that there's this level of when you're talking to people in Germany, there is this level of, I don't know if it's self-awareness or that America seems not to have at all. And Mike points this out. The idea that America played such a role post World War II in kind of telling telling Germany and Germans, you're responsible for this. You did this. There are signs that I think it's in episode 2. There's signs that are American paid for that says you did this. And the idea that they can be so quick to say, hey, you did this, you have to take responsibility for this. Meanwhile, back home, as this is happening, Mike tells a story about it. I believe it's your grandfather, was your father or grandfather was a World War II veteran. Um,
Yeah, my
and,
father was a World War II veteran.
and you tell the story about the flag, and you
Yeah.
tell the story about being back home, and anyone how dare anyone say to Americans, you guys are responsible for these horrific acts, probably, you know, just what could be one of the most, horrific acts of all time when it comes to the slave trade. And there is absolutely very little accountability, and accountability that seems to be, as we get further and further, it seems to be less of this. Um, Mike, I want to ask, and I'll ask it this way: like, when you're, how do we kind of collectively understand where we are in America and the American South, where we are clearly a country that can look post World War II and kind of force feed, if you will, Germans to have a reckoning and understanding of what they did historically. But yet we have conversations in this country even today about teaching accurate history in schools. Like how do we kind of wrap our minds around where we are here versus what you've kind of explored during this project?
Well, the hypocrisy and the lack of self-awareness or the denial is a very age-old American story. Um, when we were trying to tell Germans what they were doing wrong during the Cold War, when we were trying to tisk totalitarian states about their denial of human rights, they would throw it right back at us and point at how America was treating its black citizens. Don't think Russia or the Soviet Union and China didn't have a field day with that. And I think some of that was the impetus for some of the progress that did happen. I mean, I think people like Lyndon B. Johnson were acutely aware of how embarrassing that was on the world stage to have black people being fire hosed for global consumption while we were trying to be the global moralizer. But it's all history, and we're still living with what I just described. The lack of regard in some parts of the globe where we can't rally support on the African continent for Ukraine because Ukraine remembers that, well, the Soviets had our back, and when you were trying to exploit us in South Africa, Soviets had their back. So, all this is the sort of history that we don't talk about in our classrooms today. We're just drunk on this idea of American exceptionalism. And, they're actually trying to codify in some school districts, in some places that, this sort of kind of history that's not really history. It's like this naked patriotism and jingoism and where you aren't allowed to say that there's anything wrong with America. And it's insane.
I think we can use the word myth, mythology. And
line. Myth is, what is it? The drug, what did I say? The soap. The soap we use to cleanse.
Myth is the soap that societies use to cleanse themselves of sin. That's Michael's words, not mine.
That Mike can't remember.
That he wrote for the introduction to one of the episodes where we take a look at something in German society called the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. That's the German army during World War II, the Wehrmacht. And for years after the war in Germany, there was this idea that German soldiers were innocent bystanders. Most of the army was drafted, and something like half of German men served. And so for decades after the war, they had to cope, and society at large had to come up with a way to accept that all these men had served under Hitler. And so you had the rise of the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the idea that they were honorable soldiers just defending their homeland. And Germany went through a painful process of tearing that myth down and rewriting, that story of the war, to recast who were the good guys and the bad guys. And that was a difficult process that they underwent. And this is a story that, Mike and I, it's the lost cause, right? How do we rewrite the story of our history when it's been ingrained in people? But Germany did it. They managed to.
It reminds me, even when you're describing it, it reminds me as a kid, I was taught in Virginia public schools in Richmond that when you're a younger person in formative years of education, you would say, well, hey, George Washington, did he own slaves? Thomas Jefferson, did he own slaves? And my teachers would say, oh, yeah, 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 but they were good slave owners. I mean, it was this idea that a lot of our founding fathers were these, they were uh, compassionate. Think about how ridiculous this sounds, but it was that they were compassionate slave owners, and it was the other slave owners that were mean and whipped their slaves and beat their slaves. And you're just like, and I'm hearing this, and I'm trying to uh kind of put it together. What you said in one of the early episodes of the podcast was that there was a process. Mallory, you can probably expand on this. There was a process in which people had to basically be judged about how bad they were post the war, and then it would be like, okay, you would get, you did this, so you would either have to go to jail or work study. And there was a person that you were interviewing that said, well, it wasn't deemed that bad, but he couldn't work for 2 years. My relative couldn't work for 2 years. So, I mean, just thinking about all of these things that were put in place to try to, I guess, would it be proper to say move on, move forward to get to a place of, I don't know if they were ever getting to a place of healing, but they were definitely trying to progress.
Well, there were different approaches and different thought processes. Some people in German society said they wanted to make this like clear demarcation and move on, to put it behind them. And I think it quickly became clear that that really wasn't possible. There were years of silence. There were years where it was obvious and it was clear that being a Nazi had been a bad thing, and you did not talk about it. And so for one generation, they lived under this set of codes and this narrative shift and under silence. And then the following generation, the children of those people, were raised in an educational environment where the narratives had shifted and it was clear that the Holocaust had been a really terrible thing. And this set of people turned to their fathers and mothers and said, well, where were you during the war? What did you do during the war? And there was this difficult conflict. And I think that sort of generation felt a great burden, a set of guilt and shame at being German on the worldwide stage. I talked to people who, when they traveled abroad throughout Europe, would try to hide their German accents or wouldn't make it obvious they were German because they knew that was a shameful thing. But, that's an acknowledgement that there's something to feel shame about. And I think
there's a step one before that.
There's a step one before that. Yeah. And I don't think that shame should be the end step either, because I think the next step is this sense of responsibility. It's carrying the weight of responsibility of that history and knowing that, you've done wrong. So how do you make amends or attempt to? And so, like, for instance, German society, Angela Merkel, in 2015, during the Syrian refugee crisis, Germany opened up their borders to refugees, and the thought process on the international stage for that, the Germany's political leader said, this is our responsibility as Germans. We are not allowed to turn people away, given our history. And so it's sort of the end line, right? You go through the silence, you go through the shame and the guilt, and hopefully you land at a place of responsibility.
Mike, what do you think, as you've gone through this process and you followed Mallory's journey and you've stayed in touch, and now you've been able to dissect and talk about how what's happened over there kind of applies in the American South and in Richmond, Virginia? What did you learn that surprised you about how Germany has handled the years post World War II and the Holocaust and Nazi Germany? Is there anything that kind of just struck you as, what, I never thought of that, but they may be onto something?
Well, uh, I wasn't really aware, and it sounds silly now that I think about it, of the extent to which the U.S. influenced the process. Um, that that immediately knocked me for a loop.
Because of the
Um,
hypocrisy.
yeah,
There's that word again.
yeah. I guess I was also naive in thinking it was a relatively seamless process, or seamless as something that difficult could be. And just hearing the stories of resistance and conflict and ambivalence about, say, for instance, putting up a monument, a memorial to um, the murdered Jews. Um, it 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 was all very enlightening, um, and really more rewarding in a way to hear that how difficult the work was for them. Um, it um, I didn't realize. I mean, I thought of the Nuremberg trials before. I mean, it was such an education for me. I thought of that as like something, because it's such a big thing in our
Mhm.
pop culture, down to the Woody Allen references. But to hear how relatively inconsequential they were as far as
Mm,
bringing masses of people to justice was like a real eye opener.
mm.
Um, it, there's just so much. I mean, it was just so gratifying to just hear so much, learn so much about a chapter that I didn't know, because we really haven't explored it that much.
I mean, a couple examples of sort of how challenging it was in Germany. I mentioned the myth of the clean army. In the late 1990s, there was an exhibit challenging that myth, and it traveled all across the country. More than 500,000 people saw it. And I think of it a lot today as like the 1619 Project. It was this big, um, uh, important work of journalism and of history that helped to start to challenge people and reframe the way they thought about themselves and their country. Um, and that exhibit in Germany that did that work was bombed by neo Nazis.
Mm.
There were big protests and backlash, people arguing, why are you shaming our German men and soldiers? And then counter protests. I mean, it is the tension that we've had here. It was revealing to know that messy dialogue plays an important role. Um, as one example, I suppose.
And just thinking about how reviled the 1619 Project has come to be.
Sure.
Um, one distinction being that's 400-year-old history. I mean, it's not, you
Sure.
could make the argument it's still relatively raw and fresh in Germany, but this is
Right.
400-year-old stuff we can't deal with. And just the obvious parallel of the clean Wehrmacht. The pronunciations always.
I thought that was well done. That
That
was
was well
good.
done. That was really good. That was
I
really
mean,
good.
it does. The length of time, I think, does pose a really distinct hurdle for us, as well as the fact that, unlike Germany at the end of the war, there's no occupying force right now, like forcing us to do this work. It's
The
on
South
us.
had one,
The South had one.
a very brief moment,
That
and,
is true.
and it was game changing, which we weren't taught.
Right. No,
It was
absolutely.
you had people who were enslaved in state houses, in
Sure.
Congress, running cities better if you read some of the stuff than they were run before.
Sure. Sure.
Multiracial democracies like in Wilmington, violently overthrown because the North
Well,
wanted
I mean, in
affiliation with the
Richmond,
white Southern brethren.
there was a lot more elected officials and things. I was reading John Mitchell Jr.'s biography a couple years ago, and I had to have a conversation with Bill Martin afterwards because I was like, "You mean to tell me this was all happening in the legislature? Like John Mitchell Jr. was a city council member,
Yeah.
and I was like, what happened? And they were like, well, Jim Crow happened. And and we look at kind of gerrymandering and redistricting now, but the actual size of Jackson Ward on a map, what it used to be to what it is today, is night and day. Like, they shrunk Jackson Ward um considerably. And so no, it's just it makes complete sense. But yeah, I think the resistance of the American South and America turned into, I mean, it was the idea, like you were saying, that we would be self-critical. It's a challenge
Well,
to be self-critical now.
let's reframe just a little bit the resistance of white America,
Yeah, sir.
of
Absolutely.
of
White supremacy. Yeah,
of white supremacy, of white Southerners and white Northerners and politicians who prioritized white reconciliation
sure.
at the expense of Black Americans, who, I mean, the Virginia's state legislature was its most diverse in history in the years immediately following the Civil War.
Indeed. Indeed.
Um,
Think about if that had been allowed to continue.
Mind blowing. Mind blowing.
What America would be today if Reconstruction were not preempted.
No, that's crazy.
And I mean, another thing that really stuck out in Mallory's reporting, I can't remember the German prime minister, president, whomever, who gave the speech in which he said, "We are liberated." What a way! We've not done that yet.
Mm-mm.
You know, it's like there's still all this resistance and resentment.
so the context there is, his name was Richard von Weizsäcker, and he was the German president. And he gave a speech in, I can't remember, the 80s, the early 90s, maybe even earlier than that. And he actually had been a soldier during World War II. He had served in the German army. So he came from this place of, at least to other Germans, had this sense of moral authority on the issue to say we were wrong, and I can say that because I was wrong. And it didn't seem like that he would, other Germans didn't feel like they were being moralized at or talked down to. And he gave a very famous speech celebrating the day of liberation, the end of the war, instead of framing it as a day of defeat. And just that word change, is an example of how important it is to reframe moments in history.
Ladies and gentlemen, the voices you are hearing is Mallory Noe-Payne and Michael Paul Williams. The podcast is called Memory Wars. It is a 6-part series. It was a production of Radio IQ and distributed by PRX. Let me ask, as we kind of close out, there was an episode where I believe, Mallory, you posed the question to Mike about, is it too late for us here in America? Is it too late to do some of the difficult work that has happened in Germany and get to places where the Germans have gotten? Is it too late, and is it too kind of rigid in what is now an American culture to make it? And Mike, you had a really interesting answer to that, which is, it better not be, because if we don't do this work now, what's the future hold? It's only going to go kind of worse from here if we don't do the work. I want to get both of your senses now that this project is kind of completed and you can hear all 6 episodes anywhere you get podcasts. Make sure you check it out and subscribe and leave a comment and a donation for them as well. But what's your sense of that question now? Is it too late, and can this work be done? Is it a similar answer, or do you have a different perspective on it?
Well, as the resident pessimist of this team, I should answer first because we want to leave our viewers and listeners on an upbeat note. And I wrote about this today if it didn't get gobbled up. I was having all sorts of problems. But uh, as part of kind of a fifth anniversary piece on the white supremacist march in Charlottesville, and I name dropped our podcast in there. But it's damn near too late. I think anyone who doesn't realize we are on the brink, and the thunder rolls as if on cue. We are on the brink of uh, the potential demise of multiracial pluralistic democracy in this country is asleep. Um, just think about when Obama got elected and all the hype and all of the we're in a post-racial and just all the optimism about hope and change. That was 2008. It's a very short time ago. And think about where we are now, where we literally have legitimate fears about whether our democracy will survive. And that has been fueled in a large part by the white supremacy that still lives with us, the legacy of the white supremacy, the resurgence of these groups, to the point where they're literally in consultation with the highest halls of power as they plot an insurrection. Um, yeah, it's the wages of the sins that we've never dealt with, never addressed in this country, and they are coming home to roost for sure. And we've got a very small window to deal with this. And if a crisis like this won't, I don't know what will.
Mike, you said you used some interesting terminology and language, and it does throw me back to one of the early episodes in which might have even been the prologue when you talked about Mallory, you getting on the plane on January 6th. And Mike, you said you watched the January 6th insurrection through what you believed was probably different lenses than a lot of people watching. Of course, there were the normal shock and all, but the way that you framed it, and I was going to ask you this before you said the coming home to roost, but you probably know where I'm going with this. It reminded me so much, the way you described watching the insurrection and your thoughts about it was after the Kennedy assassination and the interview that ultimately got Minister Malcolm X suspended from the Nation of Islam. But he basically said, this is a result of all of the things that white people, white society, white supremacy culture puts in, and he used the phrase "chickens coming home to roost" when they were talking about the Kennedy assassination. You didn't say it, you didn't use the language then, but I'm just sitting here watching and being like, there's got to be something that it just so kind of starkly reminded me of the words of the minister at the time when you were watching that in January 6th. I'm sure a lot of things come to mind, but were you thinking along those lines, or did those kind of, not just Malcolm X, but kind of those civil rights leaders, and they're talking about like, hey, look, we didn't do this, you guys did this, and now look at what's happening
here. Yeah, I mean, it has been the tragic role of Black activists, and Martin Luther King comes to mind most vividly, trying to save America, literally trying to save America from itself, because hate is so corrosive. Um, you cannot foment the sort of hatred and violence and inequality that America has for so long now, and think it's possibly sustainable. It's just not sustainable. Um, People rise up or it goes sideways in the way that it's going now. So yeah, it's just people didn't want to hear chickens come home to roost. The entire nation was in a state of shock and mourning. But yeah, I mean, sometimes you have to be indelicate in saying what the reality is in a certain situation in America. And I think we've been tiptoeing around the moment we're in right now, when we need to be sounding every alarm available about what's happening because it's unimaginable.
I want to something that I sort of have come to realize throughout the process of this project is how unequally we share the burden of our history. I think that white Americans, for a large part, don't see it as their burden or their sinful past. Something that I struggled with throughout the process is we followed along in one episode a young Jewish American woman who comes back to Germany to reclaim that heritage of her ancestors there. And the burden and the weight of that trauma for her, but how she can't stop digging. She wants to learn more. She needs to learn more. And then in another story, we look at another young woman whose ancestors were Nazis. And, what sense of responsibility or burden does she feel in going back through that history? And I had been very content to know my own family's ancestry in generalities, but it became clear that it's our responsibility and it's our burden to go back and learn those specifics because it can't just be Black Americans' burden and responsibility for interrogating our past or feeling the weight of that. And so one of the episodes that you probably haven't gotten to yet, we take a look at my family history and ancestry, Mike, and our editor pushed me to do that.
Right. No, I think it's episode 5, right? Called Mallory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mallory's story. And I just, I bring it up because I think it's really important. You ask if it's too late. I don't know if it's too late or not, but if we're going to enact the kind of systemic policy changes that need to happen, I don't know that we're going to be effective at doing that until we closely interrogate why it's necessary and change public opinion on that. And that's not going to happen until people more closely interrogate the past. And feel a sense of burden and responsibility for that past.
Mallory and Michael, I'll give you both the last word in the sense of now that the episodes are released, to make sure everybody checks it out. The research has been done for a year overseas, and then even more when you come back. Mallory and Michael, where do we go from here? You've done this project. You have a newly found knowledge base and understanding. What can we apply? What can we do? Obviously, everybody needs to listen to all 6 parts, and I'm going to do my part on that. But where do we go from here, Mallory and Mike?
I was trying to sell Mallory yesterday on the idea that she needs to franchise us.
I agree. It needs to be a traveling thing.
Yeah,
I think.
yeah.
I want to send Mike to South Africa.
Oh, that would be phenomenal.
I'm up for it.
I'm sure. I'm sure.
But every country has its painful past and its way of dealing with it. I mean, you think of what South Africa did, and South Africa is still a country with a lot of challenges. But you think of where it was in my lifetime, and just the apartheid was brutal, and it was you just didn't see a way out of it other than just horrendous bloodshed. And somehow they got out of it without that. How Nelson Mandela and Bishop Tutu and how they pulled that off, I will never know. But they did, and they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And like I said, there's still challenges there, but every country has a story, and we in America tend to be so myopic and just we think our history is the only history, and that America is exceptional and doesn't need to interrogate itself, and it's insane. So I think there's so many lessons we can learn from so many other places about how they're dealing with their challenges that would be useful for us.
But the very first thing that I would really like to see happen here in Richmond is I want that slavery museum in Shockoe Bottom. And we need to have a place of remembrance and memorialization and learning that people from all over the country come to, because a lack of that is wild. and how long it's taken to get off the ground, despite so much hard work from activists. We just we need to fund it. We need to get it up and rolling, and we need to get all school children there. That'd be a great first step. Let's do that.
It's an amazing. I wonder where we are on that, because the last ones I heard was, I mean, I'm sure there was new stuff, maybe the Navy Hill proposal, but it was Governor Wilder, right, wanted to put one in Shaka Bottom, then he got mad and wanted to move it to Fredericksburg. It was something like that. And then I think it was maybe the Navy Hill product ideas. But is there plans for a kind of a slavery museum in Shaka Bottom as we speak now?
It's still way, 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 way underfunded.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you get the brick and mortar up, then there are the operational expenses. And then will it be supported? Given the mindset of folks in the current environment. There are a lot of challenges there. I remember I was like, why don't you put it in the train station? We have this glorious Victoria era train station. It sits empty. I mean, it's supposed to be an event space, but come on.
So I remember covering a report from researchers at VCU essentially laying out the economic argument for such a museum, like how much money it would help bring to the city and the downtown area. And that's all well and good. I had this conversation with a museum director in Munich, Germany. She runs the National Socialism Documentation Center. It's the Nazi Museum in Munich, which was heart of the Nazi movement. And I asked her about pushback to that museum. It's a very clear-eyed look at difficult history. And I asked when they were getting support for the museum, which is all government, it's totally government funded, it's free, paid for by the federal, state, and city government. I said, how do you measure success? Does anybody care about how much money it brings in? And she was baffled for a second by that idea, just totally baffled. She was like, what do you mean how much money? What?
Right.
She was like, well, we care about how many visitors come and everything. And I was like, yes, but is it important to sort of acknowledge, or when you were trying to get support for the museum in the first place, thinking about bringing people into the city and spending money? And she was like, no.
Not even a thought. She's
like, that's not the point of this museum. It's not an argument for this museum. This is a moral. She used that language. She was like, this is an issue of morality. This is the right thing to do.
But see, you're getting at some of the distinct cultural differences. Viewing things as a moral imperative. There was a lot of talk that I picked up on in your reporting about humility, atonement. We're just not there on any of that. I mean, there are just a lot of people in high places who feel like America has nothing to apologize for. It's just, there've got to be some tremendous attitudinal shifts on so many fronts before we can honestly interrogate this history.
And the problem is, I feel like it's going in the wrong direction. That's my challenge, because there was a moral obligation and a moral imperative in parts of the late 50s and 60s, mid 50s, 50s and 60s, where it was, when it was made known that Bull Connors was putting dogs on black people and they saw it on the 6 o'clock news, that's when the president of the United States was like, hey, we got to do something about this. This is ridiculous. My fear is there are, political events and rallies where people are getting punched in the face. The person on the stage is like, hey, take that guy out of there forcefully. And no one has a moral, there's not a moral compass that says that we got to scale this back. And that's where it throws me has me wonder if 2022 was 1963 or 62. And because we see now, even if we're talking about, we're talking about law enforcement, we see over and over again now, and in this day and age in current history, we saw one this week of dash cams or vest cams catching bad actors, if you will, doing really bad things. And it doesn't seem like there's a collective uproar where I think it would have been in different times.
We had that moment 2 years ago.
Exactly.
I
Exactly.
mean, George
Exactly.
Floyd was our Emmett Till moment, our Birmingham moment.
Exactly. I'm with you. I'm with you on this one, Mike.
But I don't know if it's the internet or what. But I mean, it seems like it doesn't have a shelf life. I don't know if we're getting desensitized to it
I think that's it.
or what. But it's just, I mean, the mass shootings on the regular. What does it take?
But look, I just keep reminding myself that when I left for Germany, Robert E. Lee was standing, and when I came back, he was down.
I'm with you. Yep. Good point, Mallory.
And it is possible. Change is possible.
Mallory, we are going to leave it there because that is the perfect last word of
That's why we work.
That's why. That's trying to meeting the moment. Ladies and gentlemen, the podcast is called Memory Wars. It is available right now, all 6 parts and the prologue. It's available anywhere podcasts are available. Obviously, this has been such a treat for me to listen, conversate, and learn from both you, Mallory, and Mike. It's a pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, until next time, we see you.